The Cybrarian presents Robert E. Howard's Conan, The Scarlet Citadel. Disclaimer: the following may contain violence, references to sex, and language that may offend. Chapter 1. They trapped the lion on Shamu's plain. They weighted his limbs with an iron chain. They cried aloud in the trumpet blast. They cried the lion is caged at last. Woe to the cities of river and plain, if ever the lion stalks again. Old Ballad. The roar of battle had died away. The shout of victory mingled with the cries of the dying. Like grey-hued leaves after an autumn storm, the fallen littered the plain. The sinking sun shimmered on burnished helmets, gilt-worked mail, silver breastplates, broken swords, and the heavy, regal folds of silken standards, overthrown in pools of curdling crimson. In silent heaps lay war horses and their steel-clad riders, flowing manes and blowing plumes stained alike in the red tide. About them and among them, like the drift of a storm, were strewn slashed and trampled bodies in steel caps and leather jerkins, archers and pikemen. The Oliphants sounded a fanfare of triumph all over the plain, and the hoofs of the victors crunched in the breasts of the vanquished, as all the straggling, shining lines converged inward like the spokes of a glittering wheel, to the spot where the last survivor still waged unequal strife. That day, Conan, king of Aquilonia, had seen the pick of his chivalry cut to pieces, smashed and hammered to bits, and swept into eternity. With 5,000 knights he had crossed the southeastern border of Aquilonia and ridden into the grassy meadowlands of Ophir, to find his former ally, King Amalrus of Ophir, drawn up against him with the hosts of Strabonus, king of Koth. Too late he had seen the trap. All that a man might do, he had done with his 5,000 cavalrymen against the 30,000 knights, archers, and spearmen of the conspirators. Without bowmen or infantry, he had hurled his armoured horsemen against the oncoming host. He had seen the knights of his foes, in their shining mail, go down before his lances, had torn the opposing centre to bits, driving the riven ranks headlong before him, only to find himself caught in a vice as the untouched wings closed in. Strabonus's Shemitish bowmen had wrought havoc among his knights, feathering them with shafts that found every crevice in their armour, shooting down the horses. The Kothian pikemen rushing in to spear the fallen riders. The mailed lancers of the routed centre had reformed, reinforced by the riders from the wings, and had charged again and again, sweeping the field by sheer weight of numbers. The Aquilonians had not fled. They had died on the field, and of the 5,000 knights who had followed Conan southward, not one left the field alive. And now the king himself stood at bay among the slashed bodies of his house troops, his back against a heap of dead horses and men. Ophirian knights in gilded mail leapt their horses over mounds of corpses to slash at the solitary figure. Squat Shemites with blue-black beards and dark-faced Kothian knights ringed him on foot. The clangor of steel rose deafeningly. The black-mailed figure of the Western King loomed among his swarming foes, dealing blows like a butcher wielding a great cleaver. Riderless horses raced down the field. About his ironclad feet grew a ring of mangled corpses. His attackers drew back from his desperate savagery, panting and livid. Now through the yelling, cursing lines rode the lords of the conquerors. Strabonos, with his broad face and crafty eyes. Amalrus, slender, fastidious, treacherous, dangerous as a cobra. And the lean vulture, Zotha-Lanti. Clad only in silken robes, his great black eyes glittering from a face that was like that of a bird of prey. Of this Kothian wizard, dark tales were told. Tousle-headed women, in northern and western villages, frightened children with his name, and rebellious slaves were brought to abased submission quicker than by the lash, with the threat of being sold to him. Men said that he had a whole library of dark works, bound in skin flayed from living human victims, and that in nameless pits below the hill whereon his palace sat, he trafficked with the powers of darkness, trading screaming girl slaves for unholy secrets. He was the real ruler of Koth. Now he grinned bleakly as the kings reined back a safe distance from the grim, ironclad figure looming among the dead. Before the savage blue eyes blazing murderously from beneath the crested, dented helmet, the boldest shrank. Conan's dark, scarred face was darker yet with passion. His black armour was hacked to tatters and splashed with blood. His great sword red to the crosspiece. In this stress, all the veneer of civilization had faded. It was a barbarian who faced his conquerors. Conan was a Cimmerian by birth, one of those fierce, moody hillmen who dwelt in their gloomy, cloudy land in the north. His saga, which had led him to the throne of Aquilonia, was the basis of a whole cycle of hero tales. So now the kings kept their distance, and Strabonos called on his Shemitish archers to loose their arrows at his foe from a distance. His captains had fallen, like ripe grain before the Cimmerian's broadsword, and Strabonos, penurious of his knights as of his coins, was frothing with fury. But Zotha shook his head. "Take him alive." "Easy to say," snarled Strabonos, uneasy lest in some way the black-maned giant might hew a path to them through the spears. "Who can take a man-eating tiger alive? By Ishtar, his heel is on the neck of my finest swordsman. It took 7 years and sacks of gold to train each, and there they lie, so much kite's meat. Arrows, I say." "Again, nay," snapped Zotha, swinging down from his horse. He laughed coldly. "Have you not learned by this time that my brain is mightier than any sword?" He passed through the lines of the pikemen, and the giants in their steel caps and mail brigandines shrank back fearfully, lest they so much as touch the skirts of his robe. Nor were the plumed knights slower in making room for him. He stepped over the corpses and came face to face with the grim king. The hosts watched in tense silence, holding their breath. The black-armoured figure loomed in terrible menace over the lean, silk-robed shape, the notched, dripping sword hovering on high. "I offer you life, Conan," said Zotha, a cruel mirth bubbling in the back of his voice. "I give you death, wizard," snarled the king, and backed by iron muscles and ferocious hate, the great sword swung, in a stroke meant to shear Zotha's lean torso in half. But even as the hosts cried out, the wizard stepped in, too quick for the eye to follow, and apparently merely laid an open hand on Conan's left forearm, from the ridged muscles of which the mail had been hacked away. The whistling blade veered from its arc, and the mailed giant crashed heavily to earth, to lie motionless. Zotha laughed silently. "Take him up, and fear not. The lion's fangs are drawn." The kings reined in, and gazed in awe at the fallen lion. Conan lay, stiffly, like a dead man, but his eyes glared up at them, wide open, and blazing with helpless fury. "What have you done to him?" asked Amalrus, uneasily. Zotha displayed a broad ring of curious design on his finger. He pressed his fingers together, and on the inner side of the ring a tiny steel fang darted out like a snake's tongue. "It is steeped in the juice of the purple lotus, which grows in the ghost-haunted swamps of southern Stygia," said the magician. "Its touch produces temporary paralysis. Put him in chains and lay him in a chariot. The sun sets, and it is time we were on the road for Kor Shemish." Strabonos turned to his general Arbanus. "We return to Kor Shemish with the wounded. Only a troop of the royal cavalry will accompany us. Your orders are to march at dawn to the Aquilonian border and invest the city of Shamar. The Ophirians will supply you with food along the march. We will rejoin you as soon as possible with reinforcements." So the host, with its steel-sheathed knights, its pikemen and archers and camp servants, went into camp in the Meadowlands, near the battlefield. And through the starry night the two kings and the sorcerer, who was greater than any king, rode to the capital of Strabonos, in the midst of the glittering palace troop, and accompanied by a long line of chariots, loaded with the wounded. In one of these chariots lay Conan, king of Aquilonia, weighted with chains, the tang of defeat in his mouth, the blind fury of a trapped tiger in his soul. The poison which had frozen his mighty limbs to helplessness had not paralyzed his brain. As the chariot in which he lay rumbled over the Meadowlands, his mind revolved maddeningly about his defeat. Amalrus had sent an emissary imploring aid against Strabonos, who, he said, was ravaging his western domain, which lay like a tippering wedge between the border of Aquilonia and the vast southern kingdom of Koth. He asked only 1,000 horsemen and the presence of Conan to hearten his demoralized subjects. Conan now mentally blasphemed. In his generosity he had come with 5 times the number the treacherous monarch had asked. In good faith he had ridden into Ophir and had been confronted by the supposed rivals allied against him. It spoke significantly of his prowess that they had brought up a whole host to trap him and his 5,000. A red cloud veiled his vision. His veins swelled with fury, and in his temples a pulse throbbed maddeningly. In all his life he had never known a greater and more helpless wrath. In swift-moving scenes, the pageant of his life passed fleetingly before his mental eye. A panorama wherein moved shadowy figures which were himself, in many guises and conditions. A skin-clad barbarian, a mercenary swordsman in horned helmet and scale-mail corselet, a corsair in a dragon-prowed galley that trailed a crimson wake of blood and pillage along southern coasts, a captain of hosts in burnished steel on a rearing black charger, a king on a golden throne with the lion banner flowing above, and throngs of grey-hued courtiers and ladies on their knees. But always the jouncing and rumbling of the chariot brought his thoughts back, to revolve with maddening monotony about the treachery of Amalrus and the sorcery of Zothar. The veins nearly burst in his temples, and cries of the wounded in the chariots filled him with ferocious satisfaction. Before midnight, they crossed the Ophirian border, and at dawn the spires of Kor Shemesh stood up gleaming and rose-tinted on the southeast horizon. The slim towers overawed by the grim Scarlet Citadel, that at a distance was like a splash of bright blood in the sky. It was the castle of Zothar. Only one narrow street, paved with marble and guarded by heavy iron gates, led up to it, where it crowned the hill dominating the city. The sides of that hill were too sheer to be climbed elsewhere. From the walls of the citadel, one could look down on the broad white streets of the city, on minareted mosques, shops, temples, mansions and markets. One could look down, too, on the palaces of the king, set in broad gardens, high-walled, luxurious riots of fruit trees and blossoms, through which artificial streams murmured, and silvery fountains rippled incessantly. Over all brooded the citadel, like a condor stooping above its prey, intent on its own dark meditations. The mighty gates between the huge towers of the outer wall clanged open, and the king rode into his capital between lines of glittering spearmen, while 50 trumpets pealed salute. But no throngs swarmed the white paved streets, to fling roses before the conqueror's hooves. Strabonos had raced ahead of news of the battle, and the people, just rousing to the occupations of the day, gaped to see their king returning with a small retinue, and were in doubt as to whether it portended a victory or defeat. Conan, life sluggishly moving in his veins again, craned his neck from the chariot floor to view the wonders of this city which men called the Queen of the South. He had thought to ride some day through these golden chased gates, at the head of his steel-clad squadrons, with the great lion banner flowing over his helmeted head. Instead he entered in chains, stripped of his armour, and thrown like a captive slave on the bronze floor of his conqueror's chariot. A wayward devilish mirth of mockery rose above his fury, but to the nervous soldiers who drove the chariot, his laughter sounded like the muttering of a rousing lion. Chapter 2. Gleaming shell of an outworn lie, fable of right divine. You gained your crowns by heritage, but blood was the price of mine. The throne that I won by blood and sweat, by crumb I will not sell, for promise of valleys filled with gold, or threat of the halls of hell. The Road of Kings. In the citadel, in a chamber with a domed ceiling of carven jet, and the fretted arches of doorways glimmering with strange, dark jewels, a strange conclave came to pass. Conan of Aquilonia, blood from unbandaged wounds caking his huge limbs, faced his captors. On either side of him stood a dozen black giants, grasping their long shafted axes. In front of him stood Zothar, and on divans lounged Strabonos and Amalrus in their silks and gold, gleaming with jewels. Naked slave boys beside them, pouring wine into cups carved of a single sapphire. In strong contrast stood Conan, grim, blood-stained, naked but for a loincloth, shackles on his mighty limbs, his blue eyes blazing beneath the tangled black mane which fell over his low-browed forehead. He dominated the scene, turning to tinsel the pomp of the conquerors by the sheer vitality of his elemental personality. And the kings in their pride and splendour were aware of it each in his secret heart, and were not at ease. Only Zotha was not disturbed. "Our destinies are quickly spoken, King of Aquilonia," said Zotha. "It is our wish to extend our empire."
"And so you want to swine my kingdom? What are you but an adventurer, seizing a crown which you had no more claim than any other wandering barbarian?"
parried Amalthus.
"We are prepared to offer you suitable compensation with the..."
"Compensation?" It was a gust of deep laughter from Conan's mighty chest.
"The price of infamy and treachery. I am a barbarian, so I shall sell my kingdom and its people for life and your filthy gold. Ha! How did you come to your crown? You and that black-faced pig beside you. Your fathers did the fighting and the suffering, and handed their crowns to you on golden platters. What you inherited without lifting a finger, except to poison a few brothers, I fought for. You sit on satin and guzzle wine the people sweat for, and talk of divine rights of sovereignty. Bah! I climbed out of the abyss of naked barbarism to the throne, and in that climb I spilt my blood, as freely as I spilt that of others. If either of us has the right to rule men, by Crom it is I. How have you proven yourselves my superiors? I found Aquilonia in the grip of a pig like you, one who traced his genealogy for 1,000 years. The land was torn with the wars of the barons, and the people cried out under oppression and taxation. Today no Aquilonian noble dares maltreat the humblest of my subjects, and the taxes of the people are lighter than anywhere else in the world. And what of you? Your brother, Amalrus, holds the eastern half of your kingdom and defies you. And you, Strabanus, your soldiers are even now besieging castles of a dozen or more rebellious barons. The people of both your kingdoms are crushed into the earth by tyrannous taxes and levies, and you would loot mine. Ha! Free my hands and I'll varnish this floor with your brains."
Zotha grinned bleakly to see the rage of his kingly companions.
"All this, truthful though it be, is beside the point. Our plans are no concern of yours. Your responsibility is at an end when you sign this parchment, which is an abdication in favor of Prince Arpello of Pelia. We will give you arms and a horse and the 5,000 golden lunas, and escort you to the eastern frontier."
Setting me adrift where I was when I rode into Aquilonia, to take service in her armies, except with the added burden of a traitor's name.
Conan's laugh was like the deep, short bark of a timber wolf.
"Arpello, eh? I've had suspicions of that butcher of Pelia. Can you not even steal and pillage, frankly and honestly? But you must have an excuse, however thin. Arpello claims a trace of royal blood, so you use him as an excuse for theft and a satrap to rule through. I'll see you in hell first." "You are a fool,"
exclaimed Amalrus.
You are in our hands. We can take both crown and life at our pleasure.
Conan's answer was neither kingly nor dignified, but characteristically instinctive in the man, whose barbaric nature had never been submerged in his adopted culture. He spat full in Amalrus's eyes. The King of Ophir leapt up with a scream of outraged fury, groping for his slender sword. Drawing it, he rushed at the Cimmerian, but Sotha intervened.
Wait, your majesty. This man is my prisoner.
Aside, wizard!
Shrieked Amalrus, maddened by the glare in the Cimmerian's blue eyes.
Back, I say!
Roared Sotha, roused to awesome wrath. His lean hand came from his wide sleeve and cast a shower of dust into the Ophirian's contorted face. Amalrus cried out and staggered back, clutching at his eyes, the sword falling from his hand. He dropped limply on the divan, while the Kothian guards looked on stolidly, and King Strabonus hurriedly gulped another goblet of wine, holding it with hands that trembled. Amalrus lowered his hands and shook his head violently, intelligence slowly drifting back into his grey eyes.
I went blind, he growled. What did you do to me, wizard?
To convince you who was the real master,
snapped Sotha. The mask of his formal pretense dropped, revealing the naked, evil personality of the man.
Strabonus has learned his lesson. Let you learn yours.
It was but a dust I found in a Stygian tomb, which I flung into your eyes. If I brush out their sight again, I will leave you to grope in darkness for the rest of your life. Amalrus shrugged his shoulders, smiled whimsically, and reached for a goblet, dissembling his fear and fury. A polished diplomat, he was quick to regain his poise. Sotha turned to Conan, who had stood imperturbably during the episode. At the wizard's gesture, the blacks laid hold of their prisoner and marched him behind Sotha, who led the way out of the chamber through an arched doorway into a winding corridor, whose floor was of many-hued mosaics, whose walls were inlaid with gold tissue and silver chasing, and from whose fretted arched ceiling swung golden censers, filling the corridor with dreamy, perfumed clouds. They turned down a smaller corridor, done in jet and black jade, gloomy and awful, which ended at a brass door, over whose arch a human skull grinned horrifically. At this door stood a fat, repellent figure, dangling a bunch of keys. Zotha's chief eunuch, Shukalai, of whom grisly tales were whispered. A man with whom a bestial lust for torture took the place of normal human passions. The brass door led onto a narrow stair that seemed to wind down into the very bowels of the hill on which the citadel stood. Down these stairs went the band, to halt at last at an iron door, the strength of which seemed unnecessary. Evidently, it did not open on outer air, yet it was built as if to withstand the battering of mangonels and rams. Shukalai opened it, and as he swung back the ponderous portal, Conan noted the evident uneasiness among the black giants who guarded him. Nor did Shukalai seem altogether devoid of nervousness as he peered into the darkness beyond. Inside the great door there was a second barrier, composed of heavy steel bars. It was fastened by an ingenious bolt which had no lock and could be worked only from the outside. This bolt shot back. The grille slid into the wall. They passed through, into a broad corridor, the floor, walls, and arched ceiling of which seemed to be cut out of solid stone. Conan knew he was far underground, even below the hill itself. The darkness pressed in on the guardsmen's torches like a sentient, animate thing. They made the king fast to a ring in the stone wall. Above his head, in a niche in the wall, they placed a torch, so that he stood in a dim semicircle of light. The blacks were anxious to be gone. They muttered among themselves and cast fearful glances at the darkness. Zotha motioned them out, and they filed through the door in a stumbling haze, as if fearing that the darkness might take tangible form and spring upon their backs. Zotha turned toward Conan, and the king noticed uneasily that the wizard's eyes shone in the semi-darkness, and that his teeth much resembled the fangs of a wolf, gleaming whitely in the shadows.
"And so farewell, barbarian,"
mocked the sorcerer.
"I must ride to Shamar and the siege. In 10 days I will be in your palace in Tamar with my warriors. What word from you shall I say to your women before I flay their dainty skins for scrolls, whereon to chronicle the triumphs of Zothalanti?"
Conan answered with a searing Cimmerian curse that would have burst the eardrums of an ordinary man, and Zotha laughed thinly and withdrew. Conan had a glimpse of his vulture-like figure through the thick-set bars as he slid home the grate. Then the heavy outer door clanged, and silence fell like a pall. Thank you for listening. For updates, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Images courtesy of Unsplash.com. Audio courtesy of YouTube Audio Library. Links and artist creditation in the description. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.